Part XI of the History of the Caliph Vathek by William Beckford. Is in the public domain. At the noise which this strange conflict occasioned in the valley, Gulchenrouz awoke, and, bewildered with terror, sprung impetuously upon an old fig tree that rose against the acclivity of the rocks; from thence gained their summits, and ran for 2 hours without once looking back. At last, exhausted with fatigue, he fell as if dead into the arms of a good old genius, whose fondness for the company of children had made it his sole occupation to protect them, and who, whilst performing his wonted rounds through the air, happening on the cruel Giaour at the instant of his growling in the horrible chasm, rescued the 50 little victims which the impiety of Vathek had devoted to his maw. These the genius brought up in nests still higher than the clouds, and himself fixed his abode in a nest more capacious than the rest, from which he had expelled the possessors that had built it. These inviolable asylums were defended against the Dives and the Afrits by waving streamers, on which were inscribed, in characters of gold that flashed like lightning, the names of Allah and the Prophet. It was there that Gulchenrouz, who as yet remained undeceived with respect to his pretended death, thought himself in the mansions of eternal peace. He admitted without fear the congratulations of his little friends, who were all assembled in the nest of the venerable genius, and vied with each other in kissing his serene forehead and beautiful eyelids. This he found to be the state congenial to his soul, remote from the inquietudes of earth, the impertinence of harems, the brutality of eunuchs, and the lubricity of women. In this peaceable society his days, months, and years glided on, nor was he less happy than the rest of his companions, for the genius, instead of burthening his pupils with perishable riches and the vain sciences of the world, conferred upon them the boon of perpetual childhood. Carathis, unaccustomed to the loss of her prey, vented 1,000 execrations on her negresses for not seizing the child, instead of amusing themselves with pinching to death the dwarfs, from which they could gain no advantage. She returned into the valley murmuring, and finding that her son was not risen from the arms of Nouronihar, discharged her ill humour upon both. The idea, however, of departing next day for Istakar, and cultivating through the good offices of the Giaour an intimacy with Eblis himself, at length consoled her chagrin. But fate had ordained it otherwise. In the evening, as Carathis was conversing with Dilara, who, through her contrivance, had become of the party, and whose taste resembled her own, Bababalouk came to acquaint her that the sky towards Samarah looked of a fiery red, and seemed to portend some alarming disaster. Immediately recurring to her astrolabes, an instrument of magic, she took the altitude of the planets, and discovered by her calculations, to her great mortification, that a formidable revolt had taken place at Samarah, that Motarchal, availing himself of the disgust which was inveterate against his brother, had incited commotions amongst the populace, and made himself master of the palace, and actually invested the great tower, to which Morakanabad had retired, with a handful of the few that had still remained faithful to Vathek. "What!" exclaimed she, "must I lose then my tower, my mutes, my negresses, my mummies, and, worse than all, the laboratory in which I have spent so many a night, without knowing at least if my hair-brained son will complete his adventure? No, I will not be the dupe. Immediately will I speed to support Morakanabad. By my formidable art the clouds shall sleet hailstones in the faces of the assailants, and shafts of red-hot iron on their heads. I will spring mines of serpents and torpedoes from beneath them, and we shall soon see the stand they will make against such an explosion." Having thus spoken, Carathis hastened to her son, who was tranquilly banqueting with Nouronihar in his superb carnation-coloured tent. "Glutton that thou art!" cried she, "were it not for me, thou wouldst soon find thyself the commander only of pies. The faithful subjects have abjured the faith they swore to thee. Motarchal, thy brother, now reigns on the hill of pied horses, and had I not some slight resources in the tower, would not be easily persuaded to abdicate. But that time may not be lost, I shall only add 4 words. Strike tent to-night, set forward, and beware how thou loiterest again by the way. Though thou hast forfeited the conditions of the parchment, I am not yet without hope. For it cannot be denied that thou hast violated to admiration the laws of hospitality by seducing the daughter of the Emir, after having partaken of his bread and his salt. Such a conduct cannot but be delightful to the Giaour, and if on thy march thou canst signalise thyself by an additional crime, all will still go well, and thou shalt enter the palace of Soliman in triumph. Adieu! Alboufaki and my negresses are waiting." Caliph had nothing to offer in reply. He wished his mother a prosperous journey, and ate on till he had finished his supper. At midnight the camp broke up amidst the flourishing of trumpets and other martial instruments, but loud indeed must have been the sound of the timbrels to overpower the blubbering of the Emir and his Longbeards, who, by an excessive profusion of tears, had so far exhausted the radical moisture, that their eyes shrivelled up in their sockets, and their hairs dropped off by the roots. Nouronihar, to whom such a symphony was painful, did not grieve to get out of hearing. She accompanied the Caliph in the imperial litter, where they amused themselves with imagining the splendour which was soon to surround them. The other women, overcome with dejection, were dolefully rocked in their cages, whilst Dilara consoled herself with anticipating the joy of celebrating the rites of fire on the stately terraces of Istakar. In 4 days they reached the spacious valley of Rocnabad. The season of spring was in all its vigour, and the grotesque branches of the almond trees in full blossom fantastically chequered the clear blue sky. The earth, variegated with hyacinths and jonquils, breathed forth a fragrance which diffused through the soul a divine repose. Myriads of bees, and scarce fewer of santons, had there taken up their abode. On the banks of the stream hives and oratories were alternately ranged, and their neatness and whiteness were set off by the deep green of the cypresses that spired up amongst them. These pious personages amused themselves with cultivating little gardens that abounded with flowers and fruits, especially musk-melons of the best flavour that Persia could boast. Sometimes dispersed over the meadow, they entertained themselves with feeding peacocks whiter than snow, and turtles more blue than the sapphire. In this manner were they occupied when the harbingers of the imperial procession began to proclaim: "Inhabitants of Rocnabad, prostrate yourselves on the brink of your pure waters, and tender your thanksgivings to heaven that vouchsafeth to show you a ray of its glory, for lo! the commander of the faithful draws near." The poor santons, filled with holy energy, having bustled to light up wax torches in their oratories, and expand the Koran on their ebony desks, went forth to meet the Caliph with baskets of honeycomb, dates, and melons. But whilst they were advancing in solemn procession and with measured steps, the horses, camels, and guards wantoned over their tulips and other flowers, and made a terrible havoc amongst them. The santons could not help casting from one eye a look of pity on the ravages committed around them, whilst the other was fixed upon the Caliph and heaven. Nouronihar, enraptured with the scenery of a place which brought back to her remembrance the pleasing solitudes where her infancy had passed, entreated Vathek to stop; but he, suspecting that each oratory might be deemed by the Giaour a distinct habitation, commanded his pioneers to level them all. The santons stood motionless with horror at the barbarous mandate, and at last broke out into lamentations; but these were uttered with so ill a grace, that Vathek bade his eunuchs to kick them from his presence. He then descended from the litter with Nouronihar. They sauntered together in the meadow, and amused themselves with culling flowers, and passing 1,000 pleasantries on each other; but the bees, who were staunch Mussulmans, thinking it their duty to revenge the insult on their dear masters the santons, assembled so zealously to do it with effect, that the Caliph and Nouronihar were glad to find their tents prepared to receive them. Bababalouk, who in capacity of purveyor had acquitted himself with applause as to peacocks and turtles, lost no time in consigning some dozens to the spit, and as many more to be fricasseed. Whilst they were feasting, laughing, carousing, and blaspheming at pleasure on the banquet so liberally furnished, the mullahs, the sheikhs, the cadis, the imams of Shiraz, who seemed not to have met the santons, arrived, leading by bridles of riband, inscribed from the Koran, a train of asses, which were loaded with the choicest fruits the country could boast. Having presented their offerings to the Caliph, they petitioned him to honour their city and mosques with his presence. Fancy not, said Vathek, that you can detain me. Your presence I condescend to accept, but beg you will let me be quiet, for I am not over fond of resisting temptation. Retire then. Yet, as it is not decent for personages so reverend to return on foot, and as you have not the appearance of expert riders, my eunuchs shall tie you on your asses, with the precaution that your backs be not turned towards me, for they understand etiquette. In this deputation were some high-stomached sheikhs who, taking Vathek for a fool, scrupled not to speak their opinion. These Bababalouk girded with double cords, and having well disciplined their asses with nettles behind, they all started with a preternatural alertness, plunging, kicking, and running foul of each other in the most ludicrous manner imaginable. Nouronihar and the Caliph mutually contended who should most enjoy so degrading a sight. They burst out in volleys of laughter to see the old men and their asses fall into the stream. The leg of one was fractured, the shoulder of another dislocated, the teeth of a third dashed out, and the rest suffered still worse. 2 days more, undisturbed by fresh embassies, having been devoted to the pleasures of Rocnabad, the expedition proceeded, leaving Shiraz on the right, and verging towards a large plain, from whence were discernible on the edge of the horizon the dark summits of the mountains of Istakar. At this prospect the Caliph and Nouronihar were unable to repress their transport. They bounded from their litter to the ground, and broke forth into such wild exclamations as amazed all within hearing. Interrogating each other, they shouted, "Are we not approaching the radiant palace of light, or gardens more delightful than those of Sheddad? Infatuated mortals!" They thus indulged delusive conjecture, unable to fathom the decrees of the Most High. The good genii, who had not totally relinquished the superintendence of Vathek, repairing to Mahomet in the 7th heaven, said, "Merciful Prophet, stretch forth thy propitious arms towards thy vice-regent, who is ready to fall irretrievably into the snare which his enemies, the Dives, have prepared to destroy him. The Giaour is awaiting his arrival in the abominable palace of fire, where, if he once set his foot, his perdition will be inevitable." Mahomet answered with an air of indignation, "He hath too well deserved to be resigned to himself; but I permit you to try if one effort more will be effectual to divert him from pursuing his ruin." One of these beneficent genii, assuming without delay the exterior of a shepherd, more renowned for his piety than all the dervises and santons of the region, took his station near a flock of white sheep on the slope of a hill, and began to pour forth from his flute such airs of pathetic melody as subdued the very soul, and awakening remorse, drove far from it every frivolous fancy. At these energetic sounds the sun hid himself beneath a gloomy cloud, and the waters of 2 little lakes, that were naturally clearer than crystal, became of a colour like blood. The whole of this superb assembly was involuntarily drawn towards the declivity of the hill. With downcast eyes they all stood abashed, each upbraiding himself with the evil he had done. The heart of Dilara palpitated, and the chief of the eunuchs, with a sigh of contrition, implored pardon of the women, who for his own satisfaction he had so often tormented. Vathek and Nouronihar turned pale in their litter, and regarding each other with haggard looks, reproached themselves, the one with 1,000 of the blackest crimes, 1,000 projects of impious ambition, the other with the desolation of her family and the perdition of the amiable Gulchenrouz. Nouronihar persuaded herself that she heard in the fatal music the groans of her dying father, and Vathek the sobs of the 50 children he had sacrificed to the Giaour. Amidst these complicated pangs of anguish, they perceived themselves impelled towards the shepherd, whose countenance was so commanding, that Vathek for the first time felt overawed, whilst Nouronihar concealed her face with her hands. The music paused, and the genius, addressing the Caliph, said, "Deluded prince, to whom Providence has confided the care of innumerable subjects, is it thus that thou fulfillest thy mission? Thy crimes are already completed, and art thou now hastening towards thy punishment? Thou knowest that beyond these mountains Eblis and his accursed Dives hold their infernal empire, and, seduced by a malignant phantom, thou art proceeding to surrender thyself to them. This moment is the last of grace allowed thee. Abandon thy atrocious purpose. Return, give back Nouronihar to her father, who still retains a few sparks of life. Destroy thy tower with all its abominations. Drive Carathis from thy councils. Be just to thy subjects, respect the ministers of the Prophet, compensate for thy impieties by an exemplary life, and instead of squandering thy days in voluptuous indulgence, lament thy crimes on the sepulchres of thy ancestors. Thou beholdest the clouds that obscure the sun. At the instant he recovers his splendour, if thy heart be not changed, the time of mercy assigned thee will be past for ever. Vathek, depressed with fear, was on the point of prostrating himself at the feet of the shepherd, whom he perceived to be of a nature superior to man, but his pride prevailing, he audaciously lifted his head, and glancing at him one of his terrible looks, said, "Whoever thou art, withhold thy useless admonitions. Thou wouldst either delude me, or art thyself deceived. If what I have done be so criminal as thou pretendest, there remains not for me a moment of grace. I have traversed a sea of blood to acquire a power which will make thy equals tremble. Deem not that I shall retire when in view of the port, or that I will relinquish her who is dearer to me than either my life or thy mercy. Let the sun appear, let him illumine my career, it matters not where it may end." On uttering these words, which made even the Genius shudder, Vathek threw himself into the arms of Nouronihar, and commanded that his horse should be forced back to the road. There was no difficulty in obeying these orders, for the attraction had ceased, the sun shone forth in all his glory, and the shepherd vanished with a lamentable scream. The fatal impression of the music of the Genius remained, notwithstanding, in the heart of Vathek's attendants. They viewed each other with looks of consternation. At the approach of night almost all of them escaped, and of this numerous assemblage there only remained the chief of the eunuchs, some idolatrous slaves, Dilara, and a few other women who, like herself, were votaries of the religion of the Magi. The Caliph, fired with the ambition of prescribing laws to the intelligences of darkness, was but little embarrassed at this dereliction. The impetuosity of his blood prevented him from sleeping, nor did he encamp any more as before. Nouronihar, whose impatience if possible exceeded his own, importuned him to hasten his march, and lavished on him 1,000 caresses to beguile all reflection. She fancied herself already more potent than Balkis, and pictured to her imagination the genii falling prostrate at the foot of her throne. In this manner they advanced by moonlight, till they came within view of the 2 towering rocks that form a kind of portal to the valley, at whose extremity rose the vast ruins of Istakar. Aloft on the mountain glimmered the fronts of various royal mausoleums, the horror of which was deepened by the shadows of night. They passed through 2 villages almost deserted, the only inhabitants remaining being a few feeble old men, who, at the sight of horses and litters, fell upon their knees and cried out, "O Heaven! Is it then by these phantoms that we have been for 6 months tormented? Alas! it was from the terror of these spectres and the noise beneath the mountains that our people have fled, and left us at the mercy of maleficent spirits." The Caliph, to whom these complaints were but unpromising auguries, drove over the bodies of these wretched old men, and at length arrived at the foot of the terrace of black marble, where he descended from his litter, handing down Nouronihar. Both with beating hearts stared wildly around them, and expected with an apprehensive shudder the approach of the Giaour. But nothing as yet announced his appearance. Part 11.